I will be trying to explain my mechanics on my game and the blueprints that are shown in them. The first one I will show here will be the AI. This is the newest edition I have, and it's basically a system so that the AI would wander around, and if the player comes into the radius of the AI, it would go ahead and cause it to now move towards and attack the player. As you can see, this is how the tree is dealt with. And if I move on over to the enemy, as you can see for now, we have it simply looking like the main player model, except just colored green to signify it's something else. In here, all we have is the event of attack because everything else is dealt with in their own tasks. The task attack links towards this, which I will showcase in just a moment. But what happens is when that does get called, this will happen. And what happens is it spawns a box trace in front of the player's position, and it will go ahead and try linking to any pawns. And if it detects the pawn, it will go ahead and set the overlapped actor variable to the hit actor and would of course apply damage. The attack task will go ahead and will just call the attack. Well, and then of course would then finish the execute, allowing the behavior tree to pass on through. The Wonder script basically just has the AI allowed to move to random points that gets created, and it links towards the get actor's location to allow it to know that that's the origin position, that it can figure out a spot near it. And again, it will go ahead and finish the execute. Now the find player service will go ahead and it will set found character to nothing. This is because the idea is that when the sphere trace gets spawned, it will go and detect the object, and if it goes ahead and detects the base character, it would set the found character to that. Which, if that's the case, it would then get towards the found character, and if it's valid, it would then set the target actor to the found character. Otherwise, it will start a delay and clear it. Now, I've got the delay so that if, for example, the player runs out of the sphere's collision, there's still enough time before the AI decides to no longer chase the player. And of course, the blueprint for the AI will simply just follow this, which in the beginning of the game, it will go ahead and run the behavior tree and blackboard, and it would then set detection radius to 500. That detection radius is based off of the service find player, which, as you can see there, search radius would be detection radius. That'll be all for what I have to explain with the AI, but I will go ahead and show you how it's done in the game. As you can see, the AI will go after the player if he's been caught, otherwise he'll start wandering after a certain amount of time has passed. And there you go. He's back to wandering around. And of course, if I'm close enough to it, it would start attacking me, which would then deal health. And going off of that, I will then showcase how the health is shown. The player of my game is a parent actor that has one child, which is the Rockbreaker. The Rockbreaker is only different via the sprint mechanic, which I will go ahead and show. But as of now, here is the base character. We've kept it mostly the same, except we have minor changes. For instance, we have the character sprint and a possible character crawl. We also have this mechanic for the sword. Now, the thing is with the sword is that it has no use in the game. We technically could leave it here in the game, and I will. It's just that the sword won't have an actual mechanic. It has no use for the game. The health part of it is linked via this BBC health component, which will go ahead, and if we connect to the eye character, which is this, you can see there is one thing called get stats, which if we go over to this interface, get stats, we link it to the character stats. And in the character stats, we have this in the right side. This will allow us to name our character, give him his portrait, and set his health, class, and shield. Now, the Rock Breaker uses incredibly similar structure, except with the different names. And of course, with the destroying of rocks. In the script, what happens is if you press this charge input, which is set to right mouse button or shift, it would go ahead and set the boolean of hold. If you release, it would let go. And as long as it is being held, it would allow the base sprint to be active. If you were to hit into an object, it would go ahead, and as long as you are holding it down, it will spawn a sphere trace wherever I set the sphere to, which I set it in front of the goat. And if this goes ahead and hits the actor, it would apply the damage, which going off of that would be the rock. What happens here is that the script in the beginning would go ahead and count for the rocks, which would then set length, and it would then set rocks needed to that length. So it finds all the rocks in the level and apply it to the script. Then what happens is that with each and every rock you rake, it would go ahead and enable this task to decrease the amount of rocks needed. Again, I will explain this section later on. So in the BBC health component, we have a couple of different things. For instance, in the beginning of the game, what will happen is that it will get stats, which would link towards the owner that you will play as. And it will grab the health and shield and set this versions of health and shield to that. It would then reset health, which basically sets max health to current health. And then what happens is it would then bind the on take any damage to damage received, which if the shield is still active, it would go ahead and when you receive damage, it would deduct your shield value And if it goes ahead and hits 0, it would set to 0, allowing for health to decrease. Now, of course, you can see this part here of Destroy Shield. What happens here is every time you get hit, it would activate this, which would then, of course, set current shield to current shield and activate a timer. Now, what happens is with this timer, it will go ahead and start recharging the shield as long as you are not getting hit. And of course, if you were to deal with health, that health wouldn't go down. It would stay up. And if you get damaged, it would go ahead and constantly call for whenever it would constantly set the current health to what it currently is. And if, of course, you don't have any more health, you will die, which the die script is here. What happens with this is that this will bind to the E character killed event dispatcher to the die script below, which what happens is that if you were to die, it would cast towards the base character and its child, the goat, and it will call the event, which, because it's binded, will cause this to happen. Now, what happens with this is it will set the player's mesh invisible and disable its input. From there, it would have a delay and load back into the main menu. With the shield, we have a tick here, which what happens is if the current shield is currently above 0, it will ensure that the shield is set to true to allow this to keep happening if you were to have 0 shield. The S character new that I mentioned in the base character and rock is created via this, which will then, of course, be text, texture, enums, and 2 floats representing each of these different categories, which, mixing that with the display names of classes, which would affect this, we then move on to the player UI. Now the health and name and class and icon will get affected here. What happens is on event construct, it will go ahead and it will bind this event to unpossessed pawn changed, which from there would then unbind the health and then it would restart the get stats. But this time it would do get stats of the new possessed character. It would grab their name and then it will go ahead and do the sequence of changing its name, icon, class, and then it will bind it. The update health bar and update shield bar is simple. What it goes ahead and does is it links towards current health and max health, which I will showcase in just a moment. And then it will go ahead and set the percentage bar to said value, as long as the out range is between 0 and 1, or I could set it to 100. Now, of course, you can see that it continues from the possessed pawn changed, that it will go ahead and it will initialize this script. This is because when we start the game, we still want it to do this in the first place. Otherwise, the initial player wouldn't even have an updated UI. And of course, we cast towards the base character, which will then grab its health and such, which would then bind and then finally update the health bar. In the bind script, we connect an input to the BPC health component, and from there, we connect it with the base character, set it to the character reference, and then starts a sequence of setting the current health, as I mentioned just a moment ago, to BPC's current health. Same applies to its max health, current shield, and max shield. Unbinding is simple. All it does is it grabs that character reference from the bind, and it will grab the BPC health component and unbind the events as long as the character reference is valid. To showcase this, we will go ahead and load into the game. And if we go ahead and walk into this enemy over here, he will start dealing damage towards our shield. If he continues to do this, our health will go down. If I were to run away, you can see that after time, our shield goes up. But our health will not. The goat will also have this similar structure applied. And it will go down. If the player was to die, it would go back to the main menu. To continue with our player HUD, we have the missions. Now, as you can see, we have the rocks, targets, and rings. We also have a taskbar on the side. Now what happens is during the start of the game, it will go ahead and it will bind the task target check, ring check, and rock check to these events here. And the idea is that once these have been called, it will go ahead and set the tick mark visible. And of course, during the start, it will disable their visibility, preventing the tick from being shown. Pressing tab will go ahead and play the animation. And when you release tab, after a second of delay, it will then reverse that animation so that the taskbar will hide again. These will go ahead and with each task, either being rings, shots, or rocks, it will display the text with each amount of rings left or total rings, etc. to each object. And this one ensures that if you are playing as a character that wouldn't have the UI of class name, health, and shield, it will ensure that the player info gets hidden. Otherwise, if you play as a character like the base character or rock breaker, it will set it to visible. Again, I can show them here, and if I hit to play, as you can see, the UI shows up, and as shown before, if I possess the different characters, they will change. And if you run into the rocks, the counter goes up, and the tick will appear. If I become a character that normally can't have a UI of class name and such, it will go ahead and not show it, while keeping the tasks above. And of course, if I press tab or hold it, as I am now, it will go ahead and show it. And if I release, after a second, it will go away. The possession PC will go ahead and if you press the possess trace button, which will be F it will spawn a sphere trace by channel, which, if you set the actors to ignore to the controlled pawn, it will go ahead and with these extras will spawn a sphere trace in front of the player. If it goes ahead and it hits a singular pawn, it will then possess the pawn. If you were to press any of the possess keys, you would then be able to also possess them. This feature won't be implemented into the game. It was initially used for testing, as well as I was originally thinking maybe I could keep the switchable volume in the game, though I've since decided that it would be better if I had it so that the player would just have to walk to the other possessions. This does make the flying one awkward, as the player would have to, of course, fly into the other player while pressing F, which could seem clunky, but that's a problem I'll have to fix. Continuing on, we have a connection to the UI, where, of course, in begin play, it would set the HUD widget towards the players that it links to, which gets to the characters. The get character will go ahead and it will set each of these values towards the actors of class of that they represent. And as I mentioned earlier, the whole is info section in the UI is mentioned here for the base character. Now, this section can be a bit clunky, but I'll try to explain it. So, whenever you possess the flying pawn, it will go ahead and it would set is info to false to prevent the UI from popping up, as well as it would then cause the possessed event in the rings to activate. It will also ensure that the is possessed variables in each of the different characters would be set to false. And if you were to unpossess from the flying, it will go ahead and hide the rings again. If you were to possess the base character, it would enable it. Same applies to the rock character. If you were to possess the first person character, it would also hide it. And if I want to, I will just go ahead and access the rings. So what happens here is, of course, with each different vest, it activates the possessed, which, if is possessed as true, it will go ahead and it will set the rings to visible. Unless you have possessed as off, which if that's the case, it will hide it. Otherwise, it will also go ahead and spin the rings. If the player were to collide into it, being the flying pawn, it will go ahead and cause it to shrink. Now, the shrink timeline is very simple. All it is a simple little timeline that will go ahead and shrink the ring. And it will also, to ensure that players cannot accidentally hit it twice, it would set the collision to false. And then, of course, it will increment the ring count, which gets used in another thing. And once the shrink animation is done, of course, it will shrink the actor. Now, what will happen, of course, is the increment ring count should be called in the key ring, which I will explain in just a moment. But as of now, if I were to continue, we have the possession game mode, which what happens here is it will do what was shown a while ago, and it will count up the length of either the rocks, rings, or shots in the scene. And it would set the variables in here, the total ones, to them. Which, of course, in the event of tick, it will go ahead and call these events. And for testing purposes, I had this so that if you were to do all 4 tasks, you can do a print string. This gets used a bunch for the different scripts, which I'll of course show. But if we were to go ahead and show, rocks win would be is that if the rocks left equals to the total, it would go ahead and call the rock task check, which is what was in the UI, as well as what's in the key. Now I will only show one of these because each key is pretty much the same. They just have minor changes like their variables names and such. But anyway, if of course the player were to walk into the key of rock, unlike the flying one where you just run into it, so you would normally just replace this with E. But in the case of this and the shooting one, if you were to go ahead and walk into it, it will activate the interface, which will just go ahead and be an E. If, of course, you press E, which will enable input whenever you do go in it, and as long as task is done, it will go ahead and destroy it, the collision, and then it will go ahead and ask add to task done, which would then eventually, of course, destroy the whole actor. In the tick, it will go ahead and spin the key, and it would set the key to hidden with the collisions not shown. But if the script, sorry, my mistake, in the begin, it will do that. It will hide it, as well as binding the increment rock break to rock break. But if you were to be done with your task, it will show them again. In the rock break, it will go ahead and it will increment the rocks left based on every time you break the rock from what was way before in the rock breaker. And whenever the rocks are equal, it will task done. Again, this is the same formula to every mission. But I will show the spline for the target system. Now, what happens here is very similar to the other ones. The only part, of course, would be that once every time you hit the target, it will go ahead and call this event, which gets affected in the key script. And of course, then it will disable the collision to prevent the player from being able to hit it again, but to ensure that players don't think, oh, there's just a now not hollowed object, I have it so that it destroys the object afterwards. If, of course, you were to see here, what happens is in the beginning it will set to move object, which will then play the move object timeline, which would, of course, update its transform location based on the lerp and links towards the spline's path. which in turn, of course, if you see here, we have the different type of designs, and whenever the targets were to be played, they'd follow it around. The final task would be the fourth one. This one is hidden in the mountain and only requires the player to run into it. I will, of course, mention that whenever you do load the game and press tab, it does give a hint that there is the fourth key. I will add a UI element to this door so that it will go ahead and, of course, it will have the E key. But once you do press E, as long as the tasks are all done, it will go ahead and set the isWin to true. And then if I want to, I can spawn particles, and then it will go ahead and open the door by setting its relative rotation and eventually destroy the collisions of the boxes, which either are the activation one or the one that blocks the player from being able to jump across the bridge. I will, of course, add something in the false so that the player will know that there is something that needs to be done. For instance, I'll likely do a UI pop-up saying, "You haven't completed all the tasks. Be sure to look above or by pressing tab." Something like that. I'll definitely show that in the gameplay video, but that's something for me to show afterwards. The isLevelIn boolean is set linked to here, which of course, if you run into it and it's set to true, it will go ahead and it will then activate the win widget and then load back into the main menu. Of course, there is a print string here which won't get used because print strings wouldn't be seen, as well as you wouldn't see it anyway because you can't reach it. I think that would be the largest majority of mechanics I can show. I do apologize that this is a long video, but I felt like this was needed to truly explain everything that my game had. Of course, I've got the other video showing my evaluations, and I will, of course, upload the future videos about the gameplay and such once I have built this game. There are a couple of minor things I'll definitely be doing, like I mentioned, but I'll sort them when I can. That'll be all, and again, as mentioned in my evaluation, I have grown to really like this module. It taught me a lot about UE5s and the mechanics in general. I learned a lot more about casting than I thought I would. I truly struggled last year to think about how casting properly works for some things, but I've learned a lot of new ways to do different things, and that's great because now I can do this again in the future or reuse some of these things in the future for projects. Goodbye.